First, Gavin Waitman invites you to climb aboard and join some fun on the river, the River Thames.
Sometimes I had a boyfriend who'd take me down to dinner. It was Poulson's or the Café de Paris, I think it was. They used to let out electric canoes. I think they were quite expensive because I put down that the price must have been colossal. And when we'd had dinner, you'd go off down the river and then your boyfriend would moor a canoe under the willow trees and ask you to come over into his arms sort of thing, and then you'd lie there for hours, under the willows.
I was only about 18 at the time. I had orders to take the boat to Skindle's Maidenhead. When I got there, my orders was to take the boat out every night under the manager of Skindle's and take her up through Bolter's Lock, laid under Clevedon Woods, and what carried on there with the gentlemen and the young girls was hard to say, but I had to be like the three brass monkeys, say nothing, know nothing, and hear nothing.
Sometimes I'd go to a dance in London and it'd be quite hot, and a boyfriend who had a lovely green Bentley with a strap over the bonnet would suggest we went down to Eton to swim, and we'd go down the Great West Road as it was then, past all the factories, and we'd end up at Cuckoo Weir in the dark. And I would strip my dress off, because I didn't wear much underneath in those days, and dive into the river with all my silver jewellery on, which was quite heavy. I had a great big necklace and bracelets and things, so I nearly sank. And we'd swim about there, and then, of course, by the time it came to get out, it was getting light, and I had no clothes on. It was a wonderful thing to do. Quite cold, really, in the end.
Lady Marguerite Tangy recalls the lush upper reaches of the Thames in the days when it was a playground for the upper crust and provided watermen like Harry Ambler with a livelihood. It was in the Edwardian period that the leafy reaches around Marlow and Maidenhead had their heyday. Long before that, the Thames had been, from time to time, a pleasure resort for Londoners. From the Elizabethan era, much of London's revelry was staged on the river in the centre of town. In very cold winters, the Thames would freeze solid. Impromptu frost fairs with stalls and the roasting of oxen would take place on the ice. It was Old London Bridge that made these fairs possible. It acted as a barrier checking the flow of the tides. The last frost fair was held in 1814. In 1832, Old London Bridge was knocked down. Until the middle of the 19th century, river pageants were held in town, the greatest of which was the Lord Mayor's Show. It was last staged on the river in the 1850s. From time to time, there have been river pageants since then. This is a police pageant from 1949. But it was the upper reaches of the river which became, from the Victorian era, the favourite resort of the new leisure classes. That's the image of the wooded reaches of the river today. Edwardian steamers like the Windsor Belle have been refurbished for pleasure trips. It's possible to take a boat way upriver because of all the locks and weirs that have been built to bypass the shallows and keep a good depth of water. Nearly all this engineering, which makes the Upper Thames navigable, was done when it was still an important highway for goods traffic. The towpaths were for horses or men drawing barges upstream. The locks and weirs built before railways took away river traffic. As the river began to lose its goods traffic, the watermen and boatmen found a new trade. Young gentlemen took up the sport of rowing. This is an early race between Oxford and Cambridge at Henley. Rowing, or punting for fun rather than for a living, gave rise to a new fashion for regattas, the most famous of which was begun at Henley. Rowing historian Richard Burnell.
In 1829, Oxford and Cambridge had their very first boat race on this reach at Henley. And there were, in the following 10 years, there were 2 or 3 other big one-off events which attracted enormous crowds, and the people in Henley realized that there was a scope for a great deal of trade here, and they called a public meeting in March of 1839 and decided to have a regatta for that purpose. There were no rowing people involved in running Henley at all in the early years. It was purely a town matter. And then gradually, as it became more technical and better rowing, they found it necessary to bring rowing people in to run it. And then, of course, in the late Victorian era, and even more so in the Edwardian era, it also became an enormous social attraction because the trains were running fast and regularly from Paddington, and people flocked in their thousands, really, and it became one of the big items in the social calendar.
The railway, filmed here in 1899, brought the Edwardian upper crust to Henley. In the 20s, anyone could go to Henley, but not everyone could afford to hire a punt on the river. Vera Ryder.
We used to go to Henley Regatta, and we liked to go on the Saturday because everything happened then. I'm talking about 1922, and there were hardly any cars, and of course no car parks. The trains ran all day and half the night, so that wasn't difficult. We felt terribly envious of the people who were actually on the river. It was simply packed with punts, hundreds of them, all with girls in their pretty dresses and beautiful hats, and young men with blazers and boaters. And we thought, oh dear, that's where we'd like to be. But it cost a lot of money to go on the river on that Henley Saturday. And we thought this was something we'd never do. And then the father of one of my friends said, well, I don't see why we shouldn't row there. Start from Reading and row all day and get there about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a long way. It was 8 miles by river, 4 locks to go through. And when we were going through the last lock, we realized it was 4 o'clock and we weren't going to see much of the racing, which was supposed to go until 5. So we did that last lap, like I don't know what, and we arrived at Henley Bridge looking rather like the losing crew in the boat race. But anyway, we were there, and we went through the bridge there, and all these hundreds of punts. You could step from one to another. They were so solid. And here were we in our big clumsy boat with its pointed prow and 4 oars. And we had to get in somehow between these punts. And we were not very welcome. I mean, people giving us very dirty looks. But the people then said, well, how have you come? You know, where have you come from? And when we told them, they said, well, fine, you know. Then they unbent and were very friendly.
Watermen went to Henley too. It provided them with work looking after boats and hiring out punts. For their children, it was a holiday. Harry Ambler.
As children, we used to look forward to a week at Henley, and that was with our parents, and the Richmond watermen used to fetch their children and wives, and they used to tow 30 punts roughly up to Henley behind a little steamer. Well, when we got through Bolter's Lock, we used to go into the meadows. The parents used to light a big fire and sit all around, and us little luncheons after having a swim and that, we used to go in the boat and sleep head to tail, and they'd be having a good old sing-song ashore. But then the next day we'd carry on to Henley. When we got to Henley, we laid in the meadows, put up our little old tents, what we had, bell tents and that, and the fathers used to let the punts out for Henley Regatta, which was a great week for all us youngsters. And that was the life we had them days.
Some of the Victorian class distinctions on the river were beginning to break down in the 20s and 30s. But a strange and persistent snobbery had arisen with the sport of rowing. Among oarsmen there was an apartheid, as George Kenyon discovered when he took up rowing at the Vickers Works in Weybridge in 1935.
The other apprentice said to me, well, how about coming down to the rowing club on Sunday? We've got a visitor's day. I didn't realise at that time what a peculiar structure the rowing world had. I became quite active and thoroughly enjoyed it, but at that time there was the virtual ban on artisans taking part in amateur regattas. You had this division between the white-collar workers and the blue-collars, you might say. And this is rather ironical at Vickers because you had people ranging from clerical grades right through to mathematicians, dressmen, designers on the white-collar side who were able to join the Amateur Rowing Association. In the works you had people ranging from unskilled people, labourers, people right through to the very highest skilled tool makers and instrument makers, people of that sort, who, because of the fact they worked with their hands, they were excluded from the amateur rowing field. And this, as I said, caused a little bit of friction between the two sides.
There were amateur rowers and professional rowers. Both could be seen on the river on the 4th of June at Eton, the celebrated boating day of the public school, filmed here in 1904. The Eton men are gentlemen and amateurs. The men rowing Edward VII's Royal Barge are watermen, professionals. They never rowed against each other. Richard Burnell.
The need to have an amateur definition came about because the gentlemen of the day didn't really want to find themselves competing against what they regarded as professionals, which meant what it says, professional watermen and the like. But in addition to that, it also meant manual workers of all sorts, who were thought to be a bit too strong and a bit too tough for gentlemen who weren't really very terribly active in those days. But it soon sort of spread. And actually, there was very good feeling between the two, but they just wanted to race separately. I doubt whether the professionals wanted to race against the amateurs. What they wanted to do was to make a livelihood out of letting boats to them and teaching them how to do it.
I used to belong to Barnesbridge Rowing Club, and as you know, it was a professional rowing club. It was called tradesmen in them days, distinction between tradesman and amateur. Anyone who was a gas fitter or a man that used his hands or a labourer, he was classed as a tradesman. Well, when you went to Henley, it was it wasn't a Henley Royal Regatta, it was Henley Town Regatta. When you went to Reading, that was Reading Town Regatta. Hammersmith was the same. You was barred from any amateur range. And I did feel put off of a class distinction because there was many a good professional rower, which is proved today through the Thames tradesmen, that was as good as any amateur going. And even to the extent that sometimes when we was out in the height, that we would pace Oxford or Cambridge over the championship course and beat them every time. And we was only common tradesmen. But that was class distinction them days. But we did feel bitter at the time.
It finally came to a head in 1936 when the Australians came over to row in the Berlin Olympic Games, and their crew wanted to come to Henley as part of its build-up practice, and their entry at Henley was rejected because they were policemen, and for some extraordinary reason at that time, policemen were classed as being manual labourers, and that, of course, was too ridiculous for anyone to stomach. That a Commonwealth crew on its way to the Olympic Games was not admissible at Henley. It was the last straw, and the rules were changed in the following year.
The rules of the Amateur Rowing Association had applied not only at Henley, but at all regattas that excluded manual workers, tradesmen and watermen. It was a distinction steeped in Victorian snobbery. But long before gentlemen began to row, watermen had had their own regattas and races. The most celebrated of these competitions was the oddly named Doggett's Coat and Badge Race. It was founded in 1715 by an Irish actor, Thomas Doggett, in gratitude to a newly qualified waterman who had rowed him home one stormy night from London Bridge to Chelsea. This was a tough race, rowed 4.5 miles against the tide. It was highly competitive, there was prize money and a good deal of betting on the winner. The tradition of these races was quite different from that of amateur rowing, which grew up later. Doggett's is still rowed today, though it's now become an amateur race. Brothers Bob and Paul Prentice were both winners.
Several years ago, when you win the Doggett's Coat and Badge, there is a prize money. Now, this prize money goes to the club who you actually belong to. Like myself and my brother Bob, we belong to the Poplar and Blackwall Rowing Club. And at the time when we won it, I think it was the sum of 100 guineas went to that rowing club. But obviously, many years ago, when the watermen was classed as professionals, that money went into their own pocket to pay for their boats, because obviously in those days they had to use their own boats.
I think the status of professionalism is really unfair, or has been unfair in years past, because, to be quite honest, rowing for a living as a waterman is completely different from competitive racing, as we would call it, in best boats or so on, you know. So I think it was unfair, and thank Christ in the later years, it was obviously in the late 50s, I believe, that we all become amateurs.
It wasn't a professional rowing race, however, which captured the popular imagination.
Come along, ladies, where your favourites? Oxford or Cambridge Blues, where your favourites now?
The annual Battle of the Blues between Oxford and Cambridge universities was from Victorian times the one major rowing event that attracted a national following. Richard Burnell rowed for Oxford in 1939.
Oh, which was a tremendous thing. I mean, particularly in those days, I think more so than now. But of course, it sets you up for life as a blue in a way that no other event does. People always ask me, do you row for Oxford or Cambridge? Very rarely I say, did you ever row for Leander, or did you ever row for Great Britain? But they do say, did you row for Oxford?
You've paid your money, take your choice, Oxford or Cambridge for the boat race. Here are the dark blues. Burnell, number 5, well over 6 feet with Steady the Crew, Walden. Alex Forbes, who rows at number 7, and Vaughan, Oxford stroke. We come back to Burnell just to emphasise how tall Massey the Cox isn't.
50 years on, Richard Burnell has his own view on why the Battle of the Blues became so popular.
My theory is the Oxford and Cambridge boat race became so popular so quickly because it got a sort of head start on all the other major sporting events. Rowing, you see, became quite a popular amateur sport long before cricket and football and tennis and things like that were. And it also, after the first one, which took place at Henley, all the rest took place in the middle of London. And it was the first big public sporting event which there was no chance to go in. And so the ordinary, everyday people all over London regarded it as a day out and flocked down to the river, first of all at Westminster and later at Putney. And so really the boat race had become more or less a national institution before other things like the cup final and the test matches had really got going at all.
Saturday. Yes, it's the day the sun always seems to shine. You can even pretend it's not just a weekend, but a Mediterranean cruise. That trip round the world you always promised yourself and the kids.
For thousands of Londoners, the river was a playground in the 1950s.
Adventure and romance.
A popular day out was a trip on a paddle steamer down through the busy port to the amusements of Southend.
And there are friends to make, folks just like yourself, forgetting what they are and who they are, joining the fun, making memories that will last not just for next week, but for always.
In the age of cheap package holidays and popular motoring, the paddle steamer disappeared.
While you're drifting along, soft guitars and a song bid you welcome.
The upper reaches of the river, however, evolved a drifting, dreamy quality that has endured as a Shangri-La to the present day.
And you'll find joy of life, peace of mind, and a welcome on Paradise Isle.
Of course, Henley was only once a year, but the rest of the time we went on the river a lot. And I worked till 6 o'clock in the evening, and we often, during the summer, took our supper with us and went on the river. And we could swim anywhere, and that was what we loved doing. And then later on we went camping at weekends. So there would be a men's party and a girls' party, but they would meet up at an island, and they would light a fire and cook their supper and then put tents up and spend the night, a couple of nights probably. And after we'd had our supper and it was beginning to get dusk, couples tended to get into punts and drift off down the river. And this was very romantic indeed. And one was totally secluded. In fact, sometimes if you looked at a punt, you would think there was nobody in it, because they had these long cushions and you could lie flat in it. And I'm sure there were occasions when perhaps a girl lost her virtue, but on the whole, we behaved very well. We had to.
One of the great days of my teen years was going down to Eton for the 4th of June. It was absolutely marvellous. All day you'd sort of sit under the trees eating cherries and watching cricket. And then at night, you all went and sat on a bank in the dark, and the 8 would come down the river, rowing quite hard and getting quite fast, and then they would suddenly stop and they would stand up with their oars above them like this and start singing boating weather, which all the crowd would join in, you know. Jolly boating weather, ta-da-da-da-da-da.